I'd like to introduce Adam Lalley, short story writer. Adam Lalley grew up in southern Connecticut and recently moved from New York City to Baltimore to study medicine. This is his first reading. That Adam Lalley cites Marilynne Robinson's Gilead as a favourite novel should come as no surprise. Adam, like many a craftsman before him, is entranced by the microscopic detail in so-called lives of quiet desperation. What Adam's unique voice adds to these often observed characters is his own layer of the wistfully absurd, a humorous take on the everyday that is full and nuanced. In his piece, Jorge, the Moon Man, for example, the titular character, feeling bored with his claims processing job and his unspectacular life, becomes entranced looking at the moon and becomes obsessed with the exotic promise he sees as inherent in this dead rock in the sky. Quote, Jorge had never really examined the moon, Adam writes, and he immediately became aware of its intricacy. It was beautiful, its nooks and crannies, its desert, its mini world. He became lost in it. Had people noticed this before? But of course they had, dude, and they had noticed it sooner. The moon? That was basic. Adam's work is anything but basic. Please join us in welcoming him to the podium. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks, David and Adrian, and thank you everyone thank you all for coming. There's a lot of death and history in this story. I think death is often the subject of history, but the impermanence of life is also the reason we value history. This story begins in 1993. Meyer Docker is 72 years old. He's a German World War II veteran. He's just lost his son and he's dying of terminal lung cancer. He joined the German army at a young age for patriotic reasons, as an American would join the US Army. And he feels betrayed by his government, by his own gullibility, and betrayed by the patterns of human thought that made World War II possible. This has made him a kind of rigorous person, and as his 3 grandsons move in with him, he begins to devote his energy toward not being remembered as just an old Nazi soldier, since his grandsons won't have the chance to get to know him as adults. So he starts writing on the walls and furniture of his study, because it feels more permanent to him than paper. And as he writes more, he begins writing more for himself and less for others. He starts having debates with 16th century French Renaissance essayists and mathematicians, and recording fragments of his random humanity. And that's pretty much where the story starts. The title is I Want Death to Find Me Planting My Cabbages, which is a quote from Montaigne. In the late summer of 1993, our grandfather began writing on his walls. He wrote instructions for his burial above the door to the hallway, asking to be put to rest in something like a bank vault, a wall of tombs about 12 feet above ground. I was 9, and in school I must have just learned about biodegradation, because I remember wondering how his body would decompose in there, and if so, how it would seep back into the earth. Our mom and dad had both been buried in graves, where it was possible to sit by them and read their names without straining. He was worried about the water table, our grandmother said. He didn't want to come up with the rain. In the spring, the cemetery flooded, and even after other parts of town had dried, the ground around the graves could be too soggy for walking. This was a pragmatic decision, and surprising, because our grandfather had never been pragmatic. For him, graves were mass-market, auto-fascist productions. Having a name on a grave, he wrote, is only barely better than anonymity. We might as well be stapled closed. In Cambodia, the Tampuan people used all their skill to make decorative huts for their deceased family members, and these were not wealthy people, so why, he wrote, if we have X-ray machines, disposable income, and disposable time, have there been no advances in the way humans are buried in the West? And so writing became his tomb. To be forgotten is an eternity of never having been. So men make monuments with the materials they have at hand, with children, politics, endowments, or war, because more than death, they fear the death of their idea of themselves. My grandfather's materials were us and his study, and in the last few months of his life, essays, journal entries, and fragments grew like ivy across his walls. In 19 years, by allowing himself only a single pen at a time, he had never lost one. He had used every one to its last drop of ink. And on more than one occasion, he lectured my brothers and me for for using 2 napkins when 1 was enough. Waste, for him, was a kind of ingratitude, and I like to imagine that at a certain point he decided that forgetting too was a kind of waste. No doubt our grandfather accepted the fact that most of a person's life is forgotten, but it must have seemed possible to him to do a respectable job with what remained, to separate what had truly been forgotten from what had merely not been thought of in a while. If he could not prolong his life, he might at least have the chance to curate it, to have a say in what version of him we remembered, to inscribe portions of his life on something solid, to once again be part of a creation, one that, unlike his son, could not die or be buried. A chance not only to record, but to publish a history, a farewell, an ode, and an epitaph. Our grandfather's baldness was beautifully hemispherical. His eyes were large, brown, and polished like old-fashioned doorknobs, and they shone with unprompted joy. His arms and legs were stippled with hairless patches that felt like the rubber of inflated balloons when we touched them, smooth and thin. He had grown up 110 miles southeast of Munich and about 20 miles south of Salzburg on a livestock farm owned by his aunt before being recruited by the Nazis. It was a story he had often told us in person, and among all his other writings, he left a partial account of it in English on the walls. One day I am fishing by a river and an official comes to me. When I go and see, it is a man with a face like a fish. His eyes were far apart and his mouth was the shape of a frown, like a trout. And this fish-faced man says to me, "Congratulations! We choose you to defend the Third Reich, to fight for a truer peace. Hitler is your Führer." At 16, he became a member of his local Hitler youth camp. It was 1939. At that time, our grandmother explained years later, your Opa was not afraid of the military. He admired Hitler because he wrote a book and was a painter. In 2 years, our grandfather found himself on the Eastern Front, marching into the Soviet Union. Germany had been making progress, and on June 22nd, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, which was to be, and remain, the bloodiest military operation in history. He usually told us stories over appetizers before our grandmother came from the stove. She would plop down in the remaining seat and try to inoculate us. "You're going to have nightmares from these stories." She laughed uncomfortably at their gruesomeness, but there was no avoiding it. The gruesomeness was the story. "The Russians were very clever," our grandfather wrote. "They had no choices. They were poor people and cannot fight like us." Throughout the war, Russian civilians armed with shovels and pitchforks had employed guerrilla tactics to occupy terrain from Belarus to Ukraine. They sabotaged German marches, stripped uniforms, souvenirs, supplies, and weapons from fallen Nazi soldiers, infiltrated Nazi ranks, sniped soldiers from within their own formations, and fled at night into the forest undetected. This carried on until our grandfather had the idea of sticking white medical tape to the brims of helmets to identify uniforms that had not yet been captured. They shredded the uniforms of any imposters who were caught and scattered sleeves and pant legs far afield as they walked, so they could not be sewn together again. But this solution was only temporary. As our grandmother explained later, another idea became more popular. If the Russians took clothes from women and children to kill Nazis, the Nazis will kill every woman and child, simply to avoid confusions. On foot and in 3 months, our grandfather had traveled the equivalent of 2/3 the width of America from coast to coast. As he wrote about it later, it was a world of mud for 6 months and a world of ice and snow for 6 months, everywhere white as far as we can see, like the earth was made but not yet painted. With the ground too frozen for mass burials, casualties lay exposed in the snow like people in a park, heaped behind ramparts as they had died, some of them frostbitten and nude and stacked like timber. From the winter of 1941 to 1944, Western Russia and the area around Stalingrad became littered with unburied corpses. Seeing the use of this, Russian guerrillas hid among the piles of bodies, many of them infested with maggots. And as the Nazis passed, the guerrillas shot the Germans in their backs, then ducked down into the bodies again. Those who had not been shot scattered behind trees. And then, as our grandfather wrote, "We had the chore of going through everyone dead body by body, because we cannot shoot everyone twice. One of my jobs in the war was to pour water over guns when the metal melts from shooting so many bullets at Soviets, so there were always more Soviets than bullets. We have to check a body with our feet or rifle handles, but not to shoot. It was a terrible smell, terrible, and sometimes the bodies were not always dead. In those first days of living with our grandparents, we were happy to listen to anybody who forgot that we were children, who didn't condescend to us by feeling as though we needed to be treated delicately. Our father, our second parent, had just died, and our grief was like a contagious illness people were waiting for us to recover from, that we knew we would recover from, but that we felt we should not recover from, because something about it felt true. Normal happiness seemed like a state of denial that belittled death. It was a betrayal of our father to be just fine afterwards, as though healing would necessarily involve forgetting. But our grandfather gave us a larger grief to insert ours into, a place where we could keep it while we moved on. History could do the grieving for us, and though history was awful, it was better than being alone. There were only 2 spare bedrooms in our grandparents' house. My younger brother Brendan was 4 and still cried in the middle of the night when he was woken, so our grandparents gave him the bedroom closest to them. And since it would have been insulting not to give my older brother James the larger room, I was left with the living room. My bed was a couch that unspooled into an obstacle at night, blocking the television, and it always felt provisional. The space was never at rest. When it was empty, it felt loud with silence, and the walls seemed to replay whatever had happened that day. I did have nightmares. A light glowed at night beneath the door to our grandfather's study, which he always kept locked, and I dreamt that behind it he was shoveling bodies into flames. It was hard work for him, scooping up rubber bodies too limp to be handled, and sweat fell down from his nose. The furnace was as big as a stable, and my mother and father were inside. I barely remembered my mother, so her face was featureless, but I remembered my father more vividly than I could in conscious life, and his shoes were melting. When he was done, our grandfather closed the iron door, muting the screams, and fell asleep like a child. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Alan. It's beautiful.